Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining our OncLive webinar, CAR T-cell therapy during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm your moderator, Daria Zangari, Scientific Director for OncLive, and I'm happy to be with all of you tonight. The mission of this webinar is to provide our listeners with a free-form discussion on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has had on CAR T-cell therapies and patients receiving those therapies. We will cover a list of topics that our panel will go through in greater detail, sharing their insights from the front lines. As you can see from this slide, we will be discussing a variety of topics today, which include the impact of CAR T-cell therapies, resources required and potential disruptions in therapy, institutional specific protocols and algorithms to facilitate continued CAR T-cell therapy, selection of patients for therapy, and managing patients who test positive for COVID. If you are listening to this webinar, we encourage you to submit any questions that you may have, and we will try to answer as many of them as we can during the Q&A portion of this webinar at the end. Joining us today, we have a distinguished panel of experts, and I'll ask each of them to introduce themselves and give their title, affiliation, and a little bit about their practice backgrounds. So we'll start off with Dr. Pulsifer. If you could introduce yourself and give us a little information about yourself.
Yes, my name is Michael Pulsifer. I'm the Director of Transplantation and Cellular Therapy at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, and I've been doing CAR T-cell studies from the very beginning, having been heavily involved in the approval of Tisagen and Leclocel, and we continue to have a very active CAR T-cell program focused mainly on pediatrics and young adults.
Great, thank you. And so later on in the discussion, we will have a focus on pediatrics, so thank you for being here. Dr. Fergault?
Hi, I'm Matt Fergault. I'm from Mass General Hospital. I'm the Assistant Program Director for our Cellular Immunotherapy Program, and I'm part of the Bone Marrow Transplant and Cellular Therapy Division. My experience is primarily in chimeric antigen receptors for heme malignancies, but also for solid tumors, as well as bone marrow transplant.
Great, thank you. Dr. Giroux?
So, hi, everybody. I am the Deputy Division Head of Hematologic Oncology at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. I used to be the head of the Adult BMT Service, and we've been heavily involved in both investigational and commercial CAR T-cell therapy. And as the Deputy Division Head, I'm in charge of both cellular therapies, Adult BMT and the Immune Effector Cell program.
Great, thank you very much. And then Dr. Schuster.
Hi, I'm Stephen Schuster. I'm the Director of the Lymphoma Program at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. My practice for the last 20 plus years has been really focused on adult lymphomas, and I've been involved with CAR T cells from the beginning, and like Michael, and was involved in the registrational trials for Tisagen Leclocel.
Great, thank you. So we do have a great deal of material to cover in this discussion tonight, so let's begin. So to start us off, I would like to provide some very quick numbers on the current state of COVID-19. Currently, to date, the number of global confirmed cases is nearing 3 million. The United States officially has the most confirmed cases at over 900,000, with over 55,000 deaths. So nationwide social distancing measures remain in effect, and we are all encouraged to follow national and local guidance. More recently, there have been discussions in some regions with lower infection rates to gradually begin opening up local economies. Despite stay-at-home orders and precautionary measures, our patients with cancer continue to require treatment in both the inpatient and outpatient settings. Tonight, our discussion will center around how cellular therapeutics have been affected and how our faculty are navigating through this time with their patients who require these life-saving therapies. So with that, I would like to start off the discussion to one of our first topics, which is the impact of COVID-19 on the delivery of CAR T-cell therapies thus far. So Dr. Fergault, I'll ask you to comment first. What has been your experience and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the delivery of CAR T-cell therapies? How has this process changed during this time for you?
Well, I think it's an ongoing and evolving process. I think every few days there's a new change to our overall infrastructure and logistics for how we're delivering these therapies. We're primarily doing outpatient lymphodepletion, and we're starting to do outpatient infusions for cellular therapy products. However, have moved that predominantly inpatient with the community exposure in the Boston area, especially with the prevalence in the urban setting. So most of our patients are being lymphodepleted and treated on the inpatient side. We've also had to institute some strict visitation restrictions for patients who are currently being treated. And things have changed in terms of our housing availability for where patients are staying afterwards. So ultimately, we really had to concentrate a lot of resources into supporting patients on the inpatient side while trying to find unique ways in housing them afterwards, while we're also screening patients and caregivers for COVID positivity prior to and then after Carty treatment, just trying to minimize any kind of infectious risk from that, as well as to the risk of other patients on the floor.
Okay, great. Great. And then Dr. Giral, how has this process changed at your institution?
Well, I think New York is the epicenter of the COVID pandemic. Memorial Sloan Kettering is a exclusive cancer center, so we're not a general hospital. So we're consider ourselves as the second line. We were advised very early on within the pandemic that it was possible that if the numbers were as bad as they were expected to be, we would be converted into a COVID hospital. So immediately that puts us into various situations. One, can we take care of the cancer patients we have appropriately? Two, are the cancer patients we're seeing well served by putting them in a situation where they will be heavily exposed to COVID, recognizing that in the Wuhan experience, cancer patients had a threefold risk of death? And three, were we going to have the resources to appropriately take care of COVID positive patients and cancer patients? So we rapidly decided to prioritize our Carty and our BMT admissions to patients who could not be delayed or patients who the likelihood of cure was so high that we think that deferring was inappropriate. And we developed a wait list that now is at 80 patients. Our census went from an average of 50 to now an average about 20 today. It's fair to say that in CAR T cells, we have limited CAR T cells to patients who have a very low risk of using ICU resources, and those are patients with low tumor mass and normal LDH. We've had to make very difficult decisions. There's some patients with high tumor bulk in which the risk of CRS and neurotoxicity was very high with Axicell and even with Tysogen. So those patients were submitted to alternative treatments, and the issue of whether they will get a CAR T cell or not will be readdressed.
Great, thank you. And then, so Dr. Frigault, just we heard how they're kind of prioritizing at Memorial Sloan Kettering. Are they doing that in the Boston area as well?
We are. So I think the one thing I didn't speak about was the fact that we're actually delaying many of our autos for myeloma and primarily focusing our efforts on allogeneic stem cell transplant and CAR T cells. We haven't necessarily limited the scope of patients that we're currently treating. However, we are picking products that may have a better safety profile, less likelihood of going to the ICU, lower likelihood of having prolonged cytopenias requiring frequent GRANAX and blood transfusions in the outpatient setting, so that we can try to shift towards more of a virtual visit following infusion. Being a general hospital, we did convert one of our hemalignancy floors actually into a COVID ICU, and so we really cut our bed space in half. But our current census is probably around, say, 30 to 40 hemalignancy patients at any given time in the hospital right now. With, I would say, about 20 to 30% are actually CAR T cells. So we've adapted other protocols in allowing low-dose pressors on the floor. So in the event that a patient becomes hypotensive, we actually have advanced nurse training that allow them to run pressors as opposed to going to the ICU while we try to intervene. So we're doing everything we can to try to, turn our hemalignancy floor that currently is left into primarily, transplant and CAR T with, all the services we would need to provide on that floor.
Great, thank you. And then Dr. Pulsifer, how about your institution? How are they currently managing it?
So there's two big differences, of course, with my institution, which is in Los Angeles, and the other institutions which are adult-focused, and being in two very COVID-heavy areas, New York and Boston. California, for whatever reason, has had less of an effect with COVID. Our peak has been lower. Our resources haven't been quite as deplete. Nonetheless, from the very beginning, we had to do what everyone else around the country was doing. We postponed any elective procedures, including elective transplants and lower risk transplants, and put a lot of CAR T cell things on hold. As we've passed our peak now and things are starting to somewhat improve, what we've been able to do now is really open up some CAR T-cell focused studies again. And one thing that's been great about the studies themselves, as well as the commercial products, is that the producers of the commercial products have bent over backwards to actually get them produced on time. So we've made some of the changes mentioned that were made in the Boston area. We're much more likely to have patients doing the whole thing inpatient than we are to do it outpatient. We have to make absolutely sure that both when we're collecting 4 CARs that they're COVID negative, and of course when they're infused that they're COVID negative. And we've had a lot of stops and starts where people are symptomatic, they're screened for COVID, we're ready to infuse, but we have to get the COVID results back. But in spite of all of that, we've been able to, I think, keep a pace of CAR T-cell delivery that's been very similar to before COVID, mainly, again, because we weren't as overwhelmed as some of the other cities have been.
Great, thank you. And then Dr. Schuster, your experience?
Very similar to aspects of what has been discussed. At the outset, we had no idea what resources would be available to our patients. And we made a decision as a group. We would identify those treatments that were considered to be potentially life-saving as essential therapies that we needed to maintain during COVID. And CAR T therapy, as well as transplant in lymphomas, were felt to be essential services. The biggest impact, and we'll probably discuss this later, has been on clinical trials and randomized clinical trials, which have been put on hold. But as a service and phase 2 trials, which would allow us to offer this service to patients without a good alternative, we felt as a group that supporting this should be prioritized. So we continued with our program, and fortunately, Philadelphia has been rather spared within the whole Penn system of 6 hospitals. I think we have 100 patients in the hospital and about 50 on ventilators. So we have capacity should our patients get sick. We didn't know that on day one, that this is how things were going to evolve. But we've been able to maintain our patient flow. There are aspects, however, that have been affected. For example, most of our CAR T-cell therapy has always been outpatient, with the exception of the axis cell patients, which we hospitalize. And we relied, for patients that are from far away, on hotels, et cetera, for housing during treatment. And those options weren't available. So for patients that were coming from far that didn't have relatives living in the area or what we considered a safe place to stay with the appropriate company, we've had to elect to hospitalize those patients. It's difficult during the COVID period when you hospitalize patients, you're essentially putting them into isolation. Our patients in the hospital are not allowed to have visitors, family or otherwise, and that's tough. But fortunately, we do treat a lot of patients from the area, and we've been managing to do a lot of outpatient therapy.
Great, thank you. And that was discussed with some of the other faculty. So we'll go on to the next topic, which is, some of the things that you talked about, Dr. Schuster, the disruptions in therapy and housing. And so, have you found that there's supply and manufacturing issues or some of these other, concerns with the resources, and how has your institution been managing those?
Believe it or not, the biggest resource problem antedates CAR T cells and has to do with the availability of bags for cryopreservation of cells. I don't think us cellular therapists realized the impact that CAR T was going to have on hematologic malignancies, in addition to what we've been doing for years with transplant, and so there has been some shortage of bags for cryopreservation. But in general, we've been able to schedule our pheresis in the same amount of time that we always have. We've had no shipping or manufacturing problems. We've had no problems receiving products back, and things have managed to work rather smoothly. In fact, in some ways, because elective procedures and procedures and therapies not considered to be essential have been put on hold, it becomes really rather easy to schedule things and to get scans done and tests done. In a way, I'm kind of spoiled.
And then, so you mentioned also moving, from an outpatient setting to an inpatient setting. So has there been issues with availability there or resources in the hospital there?
No. Like, as I said, we've been very fortunate in Philadelphia, like California. We've not had the incidence of infections that have been seen in New York and Boston. So obviously we didn't know this at the outset, but we've had capacity both in the ICU and on the floors for our patients. We felt confident, though, at the outset, very few of our patients these days go to the ICU, that we would not be straining the system by continuing to do CAR T-cell therapy.
Wonderful. And so now we'll just switch over a little bit and get some of the opinions from New York. So Dr. Geralt, what has been going on over there?
So we have to say that for us, there have been a couple of things that we've had to debate internally. One is if we could do it outpatient versus inpatient, where would they be less exposed to COVID? Our perception was we have our own residences. Hope Lodge did close, so the most commonly used lodging solution, which was the American Cancer Society Hope Lodge, had been closed. We have 20 resident units that we use. And we felt that still outpatient transplant and outpatient CAR T, when possible, was less exposure for patients than what they would be in the hospital. And it would be easier because of, as Dr. Schuster said, they would be able to be with their family. The other thing that we had to address was, personal protected equipment, which we were concerned that with a big COVID surge, we are major utilization of this in normal circumstance. That has not been a problem. Now that we have flattened the curve, we're starting to discuss how are we going to restore activity. It is a conversation because we still have, at any given time now, there's still 100 COVID patients in the hospital. We have had actually 50 COVID patients who have been in different areas of their transplant. Thankfully, and I think surprisingly, this is much less than what we would expected, partly because our patients are ingrained into social isolation and social distancing. And the severity of these infections have been less than what we've expected, maybe because they've been on chronic immunosuppressive therapy. We're looking at that. We're putting all the data together. Moving forward, though, as long as the ICU continues to be overextended, we'll continue to limit our admissions to patients who have a low risk of using that resource.
Great, thank you. And so just, kind of limiting the admissions and stuff like that, along those lines, is there a particular treatment that you tend to select one over the other if you have the option, so the axicell or the T-cell, based on adverse events?
So T-cell for us would be the priority. Unfortunately, if they do not have manufacturing slots, we'll do axicell. What has changed is our algorithm for CRS and neurotoxicity. Our threshold for use steroids and tocilizumab has decreased dramatically, again, to avoid stretching the ICU resources.
Great, thank you. And how about you, Dr. Fergal, in Boston?
I think the biggest issue for us has actually been more on the housing side and where patients are going once they do get treatment. We haven't had major bed utilization issues because we have prioritized a single floor for CAR T and transplant. I think one thing that was underestimated on our side was the fact that we had to lose a lot of skilled nursing. So oncology nurses are very skilled nurses and are very easily trainable for ICUs. And so we expanded to we increased our ICU beds by about 6-fold. And in doing so, we lost about half of our nursing staff, and so had to quickly retrain new nursing staff to treat these CAR T patients on the inpatient side. We haven't seen as much issue with apheresis with manufacturing. I just want to reiterate that all of the manufacturers and companies have been fantastic and kind of bending over backwards to get these products out. We haven't had major issues with shipping. It just more so of how do we deal with the patients. And we were debating inpatient versus outpatient. We don't have that much outpatient experience as of yet. And so it wasn't the time to necessarily experiment and try. But, the social isolation and being in a hospital for 3 to 4 weeks is not trivial, especially if they're getting chemotherapy. And as I've already mentioned, we're really just trying to focus more on virtual visits when we can. But these patients do need labs at least once a week. And so they are coming into the hospital. But we have set up, a clinical space that is completely separate for immunocompromised patients and for patients who are receiving cancer therapy. So they have different pathways, different elevators, different waiting areas to try to really isolate them as best we can, as they're already socially isolating themselves.
Great. And so then just talking a little bit about, when the patients are coming in. So how are your centers protecting patients and the medical staff? So are the patients being tested on every visit when they come in for labs and monitoring, or is it just, initial tests? What kind of processes have been implemented there?
So we initially were not testing patients unless they were symptomatic because there were limitations in testing. Since we've been able to expand, at least within our local area, our testing capabilities, we actually started drive-through testing. So within 72 hours of admission, patients are actually going to a specific predetermined area that they're scheduled to go. They can drive up to it and they actually swab them directly while they're in the car. And then that's sent off and the patients are able to go back home. So they don't even have to get out of the car, and then they have someone who's fully covered in PPE. That comes back within 24 hours, and assuming that that's negative, they'd be admitted to the floor. Previously, we were admitting and then testing once they're in-house because we didn't have that mechanism in place. But the hospital is actually moving towards screening every single patient who's being admitted into the hospital. So we're doing, a couple hundred a day.
Wow. Wow. And then Dr. Giroir, how about in New York? What is being done there?
So we had the same limitation in Boston. There was a limit to the amount of tests we have. We now have been able to ramp up. So before every procedure within 72 hours, there's COVID testing done. Before initiation of chemotherapy, there has to be a COVID negative test. And that's the same for transplant CAR T-cell or for myeloablate or myelosuppressive induction chemotherapy. And now it's expanded to any, severely immunosuppressive chemotherapy. COVID patients are actually interesting. COVID positive patients are managed by what we call the COVID outpatient team. As long as they're not hypoxic and as long as they're stable at home, this team calls them daily to check in on them. So we've actually had, peri-transplant patients with temperatures of 101, 102. We bring them in, we culture them, we start them on antibiotics, we send them back home, and we monitor them on a daily basis. This is totally different from the way we usually did things, but with the telemedicine has been a discovery, and we have a long pilot project of homebound transplant. So we've had experience dealing with transplant patients at home, but this really let us ramp up, and I think it will create a new paradigm when we get out of this.
Right. And so we do have a question that kind of goes along with this, so I'm going to ask it now. So are there any patients, pediatric or adult patients, that have developed COVID infection while waiting for CAR T? And if so, what was the outcome for those patients?
That hasn't happened to me in Philadelphia.
I'm just going to knock on wood right now. I think we all should, but I have not had that happen yet.
I will have the unfortunate case. So I had an unfortunate case of a patient was collected, CAR T cells made, and unfortunately she was exposed to COVID. So we had to delay her 2 weeks. She ended up not having COVID, but she had to be delayed because she was exposed to a COVID positive patient.
And we have one patient we're waiting on. Again, not enough time has gone by. We feel very comfortable waiting for a couple of cycles of minimal intensity chemotherapy with this particular patient until COVID hopefully goes away or is resolved.
Great. Then Dr. Pulsifer, just to continue there, so how is your center protecting patients? Is it as stringent as New York and Boston, or is it a little less stringent there?
It's even a little more stringent. We're at the stage now with our testing ability that we have the capability of testing every single inpatient So no one gets admitted to the hospital unless they have a COVID test. And that's for any elective admission. Patients who are admitted for emergent reasons are put into our COVID unit until they're proven to be COVID negative. So it's a very strict testing regime. Anyone in the hospital is tested once a week, whether they're symptomatic or not, especially if they're having any procedures done. So we've been incredibly strict about making sure that COVID is not occurring. We also have capability. So we have, of course, not just patients. Those patients have to have one parent. We isolate very similar to what the adult groups are doing, but of course they need at least one parent with them. They can't have more than one. And so we're testing parents as well to make absolutely sure that the parents are not carrying COVID.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Schuster, how about in Philadelphia?
Very much the same as everyone else. It's been interesting, though, to watch the development of testing as a resource that became increasingly available. At the beginning, we were really limited in the patients that we can test. But now, like everyone else, anybody that's getting admitted to the hospital, patients are tested. When we do our viral swabs prior to Carty, we also test for COVID now as well. And as I said, those patients that do get admitted that are test negative, they're not allowed to have visitors, and all the hospital personnel, actually all of us every day when we go into work are screened as we go in, not by testing, but by checking our temperatures and being observed as we wash our hands, and of course we change into scrubs, et cetera.
Great, thank you. So, as we've discussed, some of the processes are changing. So let's just talk a little bit about how patients are being selected for therapies and if that has been impacted. So we'll stay with you, Dr. Schuster. So how are you approaching the selection of patients for CAR T-cell therapy in the relapse refractory aggressive NHLs in the setting of COVID? So who are the optimal patients, and has the criteria changed at all?
They really haven't. I mean, the types of patients that were not going to do well with CAR-T, generally even in the pre-COVID era, we would recommend against it. And we follow the label, refractory to at least two regimens, having failed two regimens that are standard, and obviously make sure the patient's fit, with a reasonable performance status and an expectation that they'll be well enough in a month to receive the cells. So these are kind of the criteria that we've always used, and it hasn't really changed much. I think that most of the time when there's terrible events, occurring following CAR T-cell therapy, it's generally in patients that you could have predicted that by virtue of bad performance status and comorbidities, or a disease where the kinetics are just such that the tumor is growing faster than the T cells can divide. So, we've been trying to avoid that setting, even prior to COVID.
Right. And then, so are there any, so if the patients aren't candidates for CAR-T, are there therapies that you're considering more now in the setting of COVID-19, or you still kind of follow the same algorithm that you've been?
Well, more or less, we follow the same algorithm. I guess in aggressive lymphomas, there may be more of a tendency to go to an oral regimen sooner, like lenalidomide. We are giving monoclonal antibody infusions at home. We also are giving some chemotherapy regimens now at home. The silver lining in all of this COVID experience has been that we've really, it's catalyzed our ability to give patients things at home, like immunoglobulins, antibodies, chemotherapy. We can have tests drawn in the home and run at Penn. We can also do the televisits, the virtual visits, which I think are really nice. I mean, those patients that don't need a physical exam, and we can even have a nurse do vitals for us, but they don't need a physical exam. They don't have to come. They don't have to try to find parking. They don't have to sit in the waiting room, and it's quite efficient. I think that this will remain part of what we do. Also, once you're beyond the first 2 weeks, when most of the critical events are likely to happen during CAR T cell therapy, I've moved completely to the home setting, doing virtual visits, getting the labs drawn at home, and it's worked really, really well.
Wow, thank you for that. And Dr. Fergault, do you have any comments on this selection of patients?
No, our criteria really haven't changed. I think, a patient who's eligible for CAR T is a patient who's eligible for CAR T. I think it does make us think a little bit differently about how we're going to manage the peri-infusion aspects of where the patient's going to be staying, where they're coming from. We've had to screen patients a little bit more aggressively, as we've already talked about. But moving forward, the one thing I will say is that the patients that we're currently treating are the patients who were collected about a month ago. And so, we have seen decreases, at least in our area, of referrals for patients. And so I do worry and anticipate down the road, once this does start to resolve, that we may be seeing some sicker referrals coming into the system as patients who are trying to avoid, big epicenters of COVID have kind of hunkered down and gotten third or fourth line therapy that, as they continue to progress and their functional status continues to decline.
Yeah, I agree with Matt. I have seen some decrease in the referrals for CAR T. I'm not sure whether this observation is the result of physicians not referring patients in the setting of COVID, or patients themselves not wanting to leave the home or go for care in this setting either. And I worry a little bit about the post-COVID surge.
I think that I want to jump in here. I've had a number of patients that have had a similar concern, where they're hanging out at home, they're doing everything they can to avoid going to a hospital. And whether it's physicians' reticence or whether it's patients' reticence, I have a feeling, just as has been expressed earlier, that once this calms down, we're going to see sicker patients that we're postponing care. I've had to personally really encourage both parents and older patients who are a little bit older to come when they really need to come and get care, because they have just wanted to stay at home.
Thank you. So,
I mean, other than the isolation of being in the hospital and not being able to see your family, I actually feel that our hospital is quite a safe place, given the testing and screening that's going on of the patients and the screening of the personnel that are caring for the patients. I feel safer at work than I do at the supermarket.
Oh yeah, so we were joking at our hospital, much safer than Costco. We definitely we've created very safe environments in hospitals because of what's going on. And so we don't want our patients fearful that they should be able to walk through our doors.
And, this has been a strong lesson in meticulous, social distancing. And I mean, I can remember times past where we've been hit pretty hard by the flu, at the hospital and among our transplant patients. And honestly, these kinds of procedures would have really helped in those situations. I think that we've all learned a lot.
Great, thank you. And
I'll just make a plug just for people who are watching. I was just going to make a plug that for people who are watching, that, emailing any one of us and then, discussing patients and doing virtual consults, before even meeting them for the first time, we can usually try to decide whether a patient's eligible or not and try to work out the details to keep them safe at home, just for the sake of getting them an evaluation and getting moving forward for CAR T.
Yeah, and also, as you're hearing from all the speakers, I mean, we're all still operational, so there shouldn't be the perception in the community that you can't refer your appropriate patients for CAR T cell therapy.
Yeah.
So I think, the situation in New York is, an order of magnitude worse than in the other areas, but I want to echo that we are, carefully triaging our patients, particularly those who we think have a high likelihood of benefiting from CAR T cells because they have low bulk disease, low LDH, good performance status. These people we are bringing in emergently, and we are trying to get treated as soon as possible. It's the patient with the high tumor bulk, high LDH, poor performance status, where many of us are having, I think the other thing that's changed is our ability to have frank goals of care discussions with patients early in the course of, early in that first, cellular therapy consultation, to avoid, last minute, code discussions or having somebody undergo, cardiopulmonary resuscitation when there really was no chance of benefiting these patients. And I think we have to recognize in a very overstressed system, this is something that's really our responsibility to make sure we have these discussions. And, there is a moment where many of these patients, we have to provide comfort care. This is a major challenge in COVID time. Hospice services are stretched thin. Many hospice inpatients are not taking patients. We have taken patients for terminal and end-of-life care where there is no rehab facility, there is no STAR that's going to take care of them, and we do what we need to do, which is take care of them as good as we can to the end, which is very good.
And to add to what Sergio just said, part of the discussion, part of the risk of embarking on this form of therapy in the wrong patient is the patient risks dying in the hospital alone without their family. Mm-hmm. And believe me, that's a major consideration.
Thank you. Thank you for all of that. So now moving on to our younger population. So we'll have Dr. Pulsifer speak a little bit about what's being done in the pediatrics. I know he mentioned it briefly in his opening. So how has that been impacted in the younger population? This is the population where they haven't been as much at risk. So there's been, different kind of risk levels there. So has the delivery been impacted? And discuss some of the things that may be specific to the pediatric patients that you're seeing.
So there's been something that's very interesting in pediatrics in general, and that is affected many adult hospitals where they haven't been overwhelmed with COVID, and that is that essentially, because even in a high COVID activity area, there's not a huge number of patients who are admitted on the pediatric side. We have cut out all of our elective procedures, and all of a sudden now the hospital census is 60% and the outpatient census is 50%. So the hospital now is going broke or very concerned about finances, and our capacity is very high. So we really do have capacity on the pediatric side, even in highly affected areas, unless adult patients are spilling over into pediatric beds, which they are in some cases. But bottom line is there's definitely capacity on the pediatric side for this type of care, as long as we can find appropriate housing, we can make sure we have tocilizumab. Product has not been a problem, as has been mentioned here. We have to create a safe environment and take the correct precautions. So we've gone a lot faster with kind of getting back to things. We now have, we actually didn't have to shut down all of our CAR-T studies. We only shut down 1 or 2 of them temporarily, but even our studies have continued to accrue because they were considered essential and life-saving. So bottom line, ALL is the big disease, of course, in pediatrics. We see a lot of ALL patients almost invariably, by the time they get to CAR T cells, they don't have any other alternatives. They have failed transplants and they've had other problems. On occasion, we've had to take CAR T cell patients that have the risk of going to the ICU, but on the pediatric side, in general, our ICUs aren't as overwhelmed. So as long as we can secure tocilizumab at the center and make sure that we have ICU capacity, we've been able to even do CARs on patients that are high risk. In other words, going to a CAR T cell procedure with a fair amount of disease bulk. So bottom line is, on the pediatric side, we have more capacity. We're moving a little faster with getting back into studies. And we now, as an entire hospital, are trying to get regular care being done more often rather than just emergency care.
Thank you. And I know you mentioned the tocilizumab there's not been an issue with availability on your side, but being that it is being studied for COVID patients too, do you foresee that there may be a shortage or availability issues? And in that case, would there be an alternate drug that you would use?
Yeah, well, so for sure, it's been all of our worry that the tocilizumab would be snatched up by extensive use for COVID patients. We've been able to get tocilizumab, the tocilizumab action picked up. But I'm worried any day that it'll disappear for at least a period. There certainly are backups. Cetuximab can be used. There are various approaches to steroid. There's early treatment that was mentioned by Sergio, making sure that patients are treated earlier in their course of CRS. So there are things we can do to get around tocilizumab if we don't have it. Boy, we sure like having it.
Thank you. And then has anyone else experienced any issues with tocilizumab?
We haven't.
No, we very early isolated a separate stock from the, main pharmacy so that we could at least maintain our the numbers we need for the patients who are currently undergoing treatment.
Yep.
Great, thank you. And were there any other comments from our faculty and in the younger patient population? Okay. So now let's just briefly discuss how you are managing your patients that test positive for COVID. So if they test positive, we did talk a little bit about this before. So what is your current management strategy? Is it to just, officially send them home? Are you placing them in a clinical trial or putting them on some type of therapy? So Dr. Geralt, if you'd like to comment on that one first.
So we have we'll say a tiered approach. The patient that is, symptomatic, tests positive, but is not hypoxic, is not tachypnic, and is otherwise stable, we will stay at home. And as I said, the symptom management team touches base with this patient every day. The patient who we think requires hospitalization because of either hypoxia or tachypnea or very high fever and low blood pressure gets admitted. These patients are now going on protocol with a randomized trial of hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin versus best supportive care. And depending on how that patient evolves, if they get to a point where they require extensive, what we call invasive oxygen procedures, be it intubation or BiPAP, these patients are then being offered a protocol of remdesivir or convalescent plasma. And then if the patient continues to deteriorate, we do the anti-inflammatory drugs, including steroids. So we have a tiered approach, which we try to follow, and we're trying to go towards what we call an algorithmic approach, that all patients are treated in a similar way and offered similar protocols. I think in a certain knocking on wood, we now have more protocols than patients requiring them, but we still are getting a steady stream, and we're looking forward to have the definitive results and come up with a strategy that we know will work. We've been somewhat impressed with what convalescent plasma can do, but we've only had a handful of patients.
Thank you. And are there any other comments here from our faculty on what is being done at their institutions?
Our approach is much like Sergio's. If the patients are not sick enough, we manage them at home symptomatically, and then those that are sick enough to require hospitalization, we also have the randomized trial of hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, or best supportive care. And again, any anti-inflammatory approaches are used in the sickest of the patients as a last resort.
Yeah, we're doing very similar things. We're trying to get every patient we can on study for something, or at least offering it to them. I think the bigger question is for that patient who's continuing to progress from a disease standpoint, can we really wait out the COVID versus other lines of therapy that we can try? Most immunosuppression with steroids or chemotherapy approaches or targeted therapies are somewhat limited in those patients, and it really becomes a cost benefit of having a real frank discussion with the patient, or at least we presume it would be. But we've been fortunate where we haven't had to have those conversations with patients just yet, but and I hope that doesn't happen.
I mean, part of the problem is our uncertainty regarding the course of the infection in different individuals and how to predict those that are just going to, go down in flames and those that don't. And also these reports of patients that are getting second infections or reinfections with COVID, makes you worry that, even patients that are recovering, if you jeopardize their immune status, you may get recrudescence, of the infection. But again, it's a lot of uncertainty.
So kind of interesting to see what I was thinking. I mean, and then I think what Steve just said is really right on point. I've had patients 6 months post-transplant, their caregiver got sick and ended up in the ICU with COVID. They ended up with 3 days of fever. I've had patients who've been 9 years post-transplant, totally immune competent, off immune suppressive therapy, ended up in the ICU and now has just been successfully extubated. So the differences between manifestations of one patient to another is something that, one, we need to understand, but two, makes, therapeutic decisions somewhat difficult to predict. We took an option that during this period of time, anybody on immune suppressive therapy, we would not taper their calcineurin inhibitor. And if they were on less than 1 mg per kilogram of steroids, we would leave them alone until the crisis passed, because we couldn't deal with COVID positivity in somebody who was flaring with graft versus host disease.
Yeah, that's such an important point. We don't know natural history. We don't know if someone gets COVID and they're asymptomatic, how long they're going to carry it. We don't know if someone has a mild course, when we can go ahead and do something else to them, like move forward with a CAR T-cell procedure. We need this data desperately, and it's going to take a while before we understand.
Thank you. Those are all very important points. So now we're just going to open it up a little bit to some of the questions. And it was something that was mentioned before. So in the pediatric patients, Dr. Pulsifer mentioned how the clinical trials are being opened and, they're coming back. But how about for the adults? So how has COVID impacted clinical trial recruitment? Are some of these trials on hold? Is it affecting a certain study population over others? So I'll open that question up, and we'll have Dr. Geralt take that one, and then we can go to some others for some of their thoughts.
How much time do you want to give me for this? This has been... Remember, one of the things, and this is like a multidimensional question. So for the sponsored studies, the first thing that happens is institutions say, you can't have the monitors coming in. And if there's no remote monitoring capability, we can no longer be able to continue to do these studies under good clinical practices, so we have to close them to new patient approval. Two is there is the responsibility of, do I want to bring in a protocol patient at a time where we might not have the optimal resources of taking care of this patient? So high-risk protocols, high risk for utilizing ICU are protocols that we immediately said, we have to put these on hold until we know what's going on. We're now more than 4 weeks into the pandemic. The curve has flattened. We're starting to now reopen protocols. And we're feeling the challenges of, if the auditors want to come and we still don't feel comfortable bringing in auditors who we don't know whether they were exposed to COVID or not. So we now have to develop all these remote monitoring capabilities. Our research staff has been working from home. So and many of them have been redeployed to other areas. So our research capabilities are far from being what they were before the COVID pandemic. We are starting to reopen, but this has affected dramatically all our research activities, even our obligatory reporting to the CIBMTR. We have now only do the minimum necessary. We do not do research reporting because we do not have the staff to be able to consent patients and to be able to get the data.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And how about Dr. Schuster? How about at your institution?
I can only echo what Sergio said. Early on, we made the decision that in those trials, those clinical trials where there was a standard of care, we would not accrue to those trials. We'd put them on hold, and patients would get the standard of care. And again, for many of the concerns that Sergio just said, the inability to do monitoring, or maybe uncertainty regarding resources that might be used for those patients in the experimental arm that might be necessary for patients with COVID complications. Those trials that were not randomized, that were phase 2, that we deemed, very, very important approaches for patients without alternatives, we did keep open. We continue to accrue to those patients. We have developed some capabilities for remote monitoring, and I'll tell you, it's very nice. And I hope that we continue to develop that capacity even beyond the COVID epidemic. I've also learned that we can work very well as a group without all sitting in the same room or speaking face to face. People can work very effectively at a distance from home now, and still do their jobs well and communicate, well in a timely fashion. So this has been a learning experience.
Thank you. And so, just to kind of go back to one of the things we were talking about was, the community physicians, and you haven't, had as many referrals. So, have your centers had any formal outreach or communication with referral centers to assure them that you are still accepting CAR-T patients? And have you shared your safety measures with them, or has there been any communication like that?
So I'll jump in with this one because we're just a little bit ahead of what's going on, I think, in the Northeast. We developed a letter. First, what we did is a very, very thorough internal review. And that review basically was, do we have the capacity to increase our clinic volume and have people appropriately socially distanced? Do we have the capacity to admit more patients to the hospital and make sure that they are COVID-free? And that is based on the amount of COVID we have in the hospital and the procedures that we have in place. So we gathered all of that data. And coming on the heels of that, in California at least, the governor has allowed now elective procedures to be performed at hospitals. So we developed a letter that basically has our capacity. We are circulating it to our patients to make sure that they know that we have a safe environment and that it is okay, if they feel comfortable, for them to come in to have even elective procedures in addition to the more to the life-saving procedures that we were offering previously. So we're beginning that process that all of us are going to have to go through of trying to figure out how to get people so they're no longer afraid of the hospitals, so they're referring to the major centers for these type of important procedures, and at the same time being reassured that the patients are going to be safe when they arrive.
Thank you. And
I think it is.
Go ahead.
I think there is a little bit of, there's some difficulty that we're trying to plan for moving forward. We're still hoping that we're starting to flatten the curve, at least in Boston. And what we're going to have to do is basically have two different pathways. One that has COVID risk and one that's COVID rule out, right? So if you have patients who are coming in, you need to have two clinical apparatuses set up for your oncology patients who may have a loved one who may have COVID, or they previously had COVID, or relatively asymptomatic. So I think the coming out of the post-COVID kind of surge is something we're still all trying to figure out. And unfortunately, the outreach has not really happened yet, partly because, at least in Boston, we don't know what the structure is going to look like. We're mainly just trying to assure people that if they do have a patient that they do need to have treated or want to be evaluated, we'll find a way to do it. We just can't give you a solidified pathway to get there yet.
Thank you. So just another question, there's been some talks that this potentially could flare up again, in the fall or next winter. So have there been talks of any contingency plans at your institutions?
Let's take 1 to 2 steps forward. I think that we've heard of the wave pattern that has been predicted. We don't know. I mean, there's been a pretty dramatic prediction that if we back off too quickly, we will not wait till the fall. We'll be running into trouble in July. We don't yet fully know whether this is seasonal or how significant any seasonal variation could be, especially when we've totally messed up the season. One of the reasons why influenza goes away is because everyone goes outside. They're no longer cooped up and they're not exposed to each other. And we've been not going anywhere. We've been staying at home and totally disrupting the seasonality if it could occur. So there are a lot of unknowns, and I think every one of us, as we move forward with trying to figure out how to move back into a normal system, is going to be keeping a whole bunch of contingency plans for when we move up to where we have to really deal directly with a resurgence. We don't know when it's coming, but it might.
Yeah, we're never going to be able to go back to, the way it was. I mean, we're always going to have contingency plans and be on alert for this sort of situation.
Thank you. And so then one final question. This has been kind of a controversial area. So are there any thoughts from our group on testing for COVID-19 antibodies?
So we're actually, I told my staff to get completely. Yeah, sorry about that. We're doing routine testing of all our staff now already. I'm sure that people are way ahead in other places.
Yeah. We're starting to do an IgG/IgM assay internally.
I think we're doing it. Something like 700 out of 700 people. This is what I heard today. Again, it could be hearsay. Of 700 tests, related to staff for antibodies, 30 were positive without an antecedent history of COVID.
So in New York, we know that at least in New York City, 1 out of 5 patients have been exposed and have antibodies. We're not routinely testing antibodies in patients who have had COVID. We've tested antibodies in employees who've had COVID with the idea that we would develop convalescent plasma. We would request, ask them if they would want to donate convalescent plasma. I think first we need a test that we can rely on. Many of the tests that have been purported have not been very good. And second is, what do you do with the test once it's positive? Now you give people an immunity passport, you can go wherever you want. There are questions about whether the immunity is complete, people can get reinfected. So I think until those questions are answered, the main utility of an antibody test is to be able to decide if the person is a potential convalescent plasma donor.
And then I guess just to kind of follow that, for my own question is, when you get the test, is it just reporting positive? Does it report a level? How are you interpreting that? Or how is that interpreted?
The ones we've seen are reporting titers.
Okay.
Right. And one other thing to add to what Sir said is, there's big benefits, I think, of over time getting enough data that we can really understand what titer levels mean.
Yeah, that's the most important point. I mean, the main reason for doing these tests is to learn about the natural history of the disease, the development of immunity, better understanding of the natural history. And I think that's the tests that we're doing for antibodies are just for that reason. We're not making any clinical decisions based on that. We also have a convalescent plasma program as well, but we're also just doing a large epidemiologic study.
Yeah, we still don't know what the prevalence is in the community based on lack of testing, so there's a lot to learn.
Thank you.
And I don't think the 700 patients that are hospital employees that we tested represent the regular community. So you're right. We need to do broader studies.
Great, thank you. So it does seem like there is a lot of research to be done in this area. So that appears to be all the time we have tonight. Again, I would like to give a huge thank you to our faculty for taking the time to sit down with us virtually and convey these pivotal discussion topics with our audience. Thank you to our listeners, and I truly hope you were able to gain valuable insight into how cancer treatment is changing during this time. You will be able to listen back and watch this webinar again shortly following the webinar. Continue to visit OncLive.com, sign up for our e-newsletters, or follow us on social media, on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook to get updates on when we will be broadcasting more of these webinars. Also visit OncLive.com for additional updates from our leading cancer experts. So that concludes our webcast tonight. Thank you and have a wonderful night.
Thanks.
Thank you.